Good evening. I'm Ken Jacobson, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Holocaust Memorial Committee to the Yom HaShoah commemoration. The committee has been presenting survivors to our community for more than 40 years. Our events, held once or twice a year, alternate between two synagogues, Young Israel Shomrai Emunah and Kemp Synagogue, and we are very grateful to our hosts for this event. The co-sponsoring organizations are Berman Hebrew Academy, Or HaTorah Sulam, Torah School of Greater Washington, Woodside Synagogue, and Yeshiva of Greater Washington. We also welcome our hearing impaired audience. Our interpreting services have been provided courtesy of Vital Signs. The Holocaust and the founding of Israel are the defining Jewish events of the 20th century and beyond. 80 years later, we remain deeply affected by the systematic murder of 6 million European Jews, including many in our own family circles. We honor the memory of those Holocaust survivors in our own community who passed away since last Yom HaShoah. Here is a slide, please advance, showing the statistics for the largest groups of Jews murdered in the Holocaust from 1938 to 45 by region and method. I was surprised to learn that the murders by shooting and asphyxiation wagons in the Nazi-occupied Soviet Union actually exceeded the number killed in Auschwitz. There are no survivors to speak about the Holocaust from among those 1.3 million Jews subjected to shooting and asphyxiation by engine exhaust. Note also that 800,000 were killed in the ghettos, which is part of tonight's speaker's experience during the war. She and her mother escaped from 2 ghettos and joined the partisans. Recently, we have seen the memory of the Holocaust used and misused frequently in public discourse. Our objective is to raise awareness of and spread the facts about the racist campaign that annihilated 1/3 of world Jewry by hearing testimony directly from survivors. Given the renewed rise in anti-Semitism in the US and worldwide, and the spreading of misinformation about the Shoah, events such as tonight's are particularly important. Before we hear from Mrs. Goldfarb, it's my pleasure to introduce our Mora d'Asra, Rabbi Dovid Rosenbaum of Young Israel Shomrai Emunah, to speak. Rabbi, please.
Thank you very much, Ken and Debbie Katz and all of the members of the committee. Also want to thank, of course, everyone for joining us this evening. I want to recognize the presence of Rabbi Bram Weinberg, Rabbi of Kemp Synagogue, who was the synagogue that we're so fortunate to partner with for decades in presenting this program. In yesterday's Torah reading, we're told of the tragic story of the passing of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, the high priest. And there's a 2-word quote that is so often reflected on when we read of the story, which is Vayidom Aaron. Aaron was quiet. There was nothing to say. How does one understand the tragedy of losing loved ones? And of course, whenever we think about the Holocaust, there are so many moments that we as a people, whether it be as individuals, whether it be as families, or as a nation, have to just draw on that message of Vayidom Aaron. We just don't know. We just don't understand. And somehow, some way, we have to accept it. But what I want to reflect on for a brief moment is the following section in yesterday's Torah portion. There's a very technical discussion between Moses and Aaron and Aaron's surviving sons as to what roles they should continue to play as priests in the sanctuary, even though their loved ones have passed. And there's a lot of discussion. It happens to be some of the things which Moses tells Aaron are very much isolated to this circumstance, would not even be the rule in future contexts. But I think, so it seems to be a very, very technical discussion, hard to relate to it. But we would like to think, of course, that everything written in the Torah brings with it a lesson. And I think one lesson we can extract from the technical discussion between Moses and Aaron as to what Aaron and his sons are and are not supposed to do is that it's not only a Jewish value to accept loss, it's very much a Jewish value to move on, to build forward with all of the pain, keeping all those memories, but pushing forward. And if you think about it in that way, it's a fascinating message that the Torah is implying to us, that for all of Aaron and his sons' sorrow and mourning, they still have a mission. And I think if we think about the tremendous role of Holocaust survivors, we have the great honor to hear in a few moments, God willing, Mrs. Goldfarb, who built a family after surviving the Holocaust. There's so much to learn from that. I personally think one of the highlights of this annual program is the Generations Candlelighting Ceremony. And we get to see different members of our community, and thank God their families have flourished. All those families are only around today because people like Mrs. Goldfarb took the terrible pain that they experienced and somehow, some way moved forward. As Ken mentioned so eloquently, it's essential for us to get together. It's essential for us to remember what happened. It's essential for us to take strength by being together, to hear firsthand testimony. But perhaps as part of the Jewish people, it's also essential for us to reflect on the tremendous courage needed by people such as our speaker tonight to somehow move forward. And that's something that we don't only mourn the Holocaust, we celebrate and honor the tremendous fortitude. And we recognize that we're only here tonight because of such tremendous character. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for the Dvar Torah. For the past 6 years, we have asked community members who are children of survivors to briefly describe their families' experiences in candlelighting in memory of the 6 million. This is known as the Generations Program. As soon as I load it, we will now hear that presentation, which was coordinated, as always, by Sylvia Goldberg, whom we thank.
Good evening. I'll introduce myself, Sylvia Goldberg, member for a long time of the Holocaust Committee. This evening, we are proud to present the Generations Candlelighting Ceremony. The generations, these are people in our community who are second generation Holocaust survivors, which means their parents survived the war. They're going to share with us glimpses into their parents' lives, photographs of their parents, photographs of the generations that came after even these generations, which we are so proud of. I want to thank Ken Jacobson for his invaluable help in putting this program together every year. He wears many hats, and I'm grateful he chose to wear this hat this year. So without further ado, I present to you the virtual candlelighting ceremony by the generations.
My name is Doksycy. My father was born in a town called Rosenbaum, now part of Belarus, but at the time part of Poland, which itself was part of Russia. The family had lived there for at least 300 years, and the town was actually quite full of people named Zakheim. He graduated Ramaylis Yeshiva with Smicha and Stepan Batori University, and became the general counsel for the Jewish community of Lithuania, and also the advisor to and secretary to the Gaon Rav Chaim Ozer Brzezinski. When the Soviets marched in, he was a well-known anti-communist, and since he'd been involved in bringing the yeshivas to Vilna after Germany invaded Poland, he went with them and with my late uncle when they escaped from Vilna. He actually left in 1941 because the NKVD had a price on his head in March of 41 before the Nazis moved in. When the Nazis did come in, they eliminated my grandfather, my grandmother, two of my aunts, and virtually the entire town of Rozhnoye. They were all sent to Treblinka. My father, together with the yeshiva, escaped to Japan and ultimately to China, where he practiced law again and looked after the interests of the yeshiva, and then came to the United States, as I said, in 1946. I would also point out that there was another massive pogrom during the Civil War after the Soviet Union was proclaimed. And during that Civil War, my mother's family escaped to the United States in 1921, but not before several of her uncles were killed. Some were killed by the communists, some were killed by the fascists. It was so bad that one of them was killed right in front of her grandfather. And her grandfather adopted her. She was an orphan. And I'm here because my parents both were able to escape their different pogroms. And I think when we think about that, and we think about Jews around the world who still may be in trouble, as we say on Monday and Thursday, Achenu B'nai Yisrael, the Rabbani Shalom, we hope will get them out and hopefully bring them to safety. And we should remember those who fell in the 40s and those who fell many years earlier as well.
Hello, my name is Nancy Karkowski. My parents, Beatrice Kleinbart and Joseph Hrskovitz, were both born in Seredna, Czechoslovakia. My mother was the oldest of 9 children. Her father owned the general store in Seredna. When Kristallnacht happened, all the Jewish homes had broken windows. My grandfather sent my mother, 16, to Dvar, Hungary, to buy glass to fix the broken windows. On the second night of Passover, Czech police and German soldiers took all the Jews of Seredna to a warehouse near the train station. They had no food or water. The children were crying from hunger, thirst, and fear. One of the officers kept pushing my mother's grandmother. My mother said to him, "Please stop pushing my grandmother." The officer beat my mother over the head until she passed out. When my mother woke up, they were all in Auschwitz, a concentration camp. My mother's grandmother told them, "Eat whatever you can. Try to stay alive." My mother, one of her sisters, and one of her aunts were sent to a line with young adults. They never saw the rest of the family again. The Nazis shaved everyone's head and made them put on striped pajamas. All they had to eat every day was 1 cup of brown liquid, 1 slice of bread, and 1 bowl of watery soup. The Nazis made them stand at attention or march for hours in freezing cold weather. Near the end of the war, Count Bernadette, a UN official, gave the Nazis $1 million to save a train full of Christian women. Somehow, my mother, Helen, and Esther were pushed onto that train. They were taken to Sweden and survived. My parents had 3 children, me, my sister Brenda, and my brother Marty. My late husband Avi and I have 6 children. They are all married and have children of their own. My sister Brenda has 4 children. 2 of them live in Israel. Her son served in the IDF. My brother Marty worked for the IDF. His 2 sons and his daughter served in the IDF. The Nazis tried to destroy our family, but my parents left a legacy of Jewish strength, resilience, hope, and pride to their many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Am Yisrael Chai.
My name is Henry Met Rosenbaum. My parents, Paul Rosenbaum and Ruth Met Rosenbaum, were Holocaust survivors. In 1939, they were both living in Tarnów, Poland, a town of some 40,000 inhabitants, half of whom were Jewish. My mother, Ruth Met, was a 27-year-old single woman working as a seamstress. Raised in an Orthodox family, she played sports, enjoyed hikes in the woods and mountains, and joined Shomrai, a secular Zionist organization. My father was a 32-year-old married man with a wife and 2 children, Shlomo and Amalia. He was the second youngest of 11 siblings. After apprenticing as a tailor, he and his younger brother opened a successful factory, manufacturing women's coats. In September of 1939, Germany invades and conquers Poland. The world of Rachel Met and Pinchas Rosenbaum was destroyed. Their lives and destinies changed forever. Both of them were prisoners of several concentration and death camps and were finally liberated from the same camp, Mauthausen, in 1945. They found each other in the Bad Ischl displaced persons camp, married in June 1946, and came to the United States in November of 1947. Pinchas Rosenbaum's wife and 2 children and 4 of his siblings and their families were exterminated. Rachel Met's father and brother and 2 older sisters and their families were also murdered by the Nazis. They had 2 children, my sister Sonia and I, who brought into this world 8 grandchildren, and at this point, 18 great-grandchildren. The miracle of their survival is that despite their journey to hell and back, they were proud Jews, loving and caring parents, and carried themselves with strength and dignity. Am Yisrael Chai.
My father and me, the Holocaust was a big secret. My father, Aaron Mansfield, would say he grew up in a typical, by which he meant conventional, Gerach Hasidic family in Lodz, Poland. In his 20s, professionally, he became a Yiddish journalist. Later, under the Nazis, my father was sent to the Dora concentration camp, then to Buchenwald, and finally to Bergen-Belsen, where he was liberated by the British Army. One Holocaust story that my father told me, and he told it to me a few times, was that once he was in a selection where he was asked to identify his profession. Rather than tell the truth that before the war he had been a Yiddish journalist, which he figured was of little use in a concentration camp, he responded, "Ja, ich bin ein Schlossmeister, I'm a locksmith." He then pretended to fix broken locks. Although he knew from the craft of locksmithing what a modern Orthodox Jew knows from Yiddish journalism, i.e. nothing. When eventually confronted with his failure at fixing only locks, my father played indignant, telling the Nazis it was their fault because they hadn't given him the proper tools needed by a skilled craftsman like himself. My dad would finish telling the story and look at me and say, I'm telling you a big secret. Of everything I experienced, this was the most suffering, having to pretend. That's the truth of human nature, my father would say at the end of the story. My father knew I loved the story. He thought I loved it because of the clever way he outwitted the Nazis. But I loved it because I felt my father had taught me the truth of human nature. I never told my father the real reason I loved the story. And that was my big secret.
My name is Esther Rosemarin. I light this candle in memory of my parents and my aunts, uncles, and grandparents that were killed in the Holocaust. Both my parents came from Lutsk, Poland, which is now part of the Ukraine. Lutz's population consisted of 48% Jews. My mother was born Gitta Linebinder. She was one of 6 children. Only 2 survived, my mother and her brother, who had left for Israel before the war. When the Germans entered Lutsk on June 26, 1941, they rounded up most of the Jews, brought them to Lubart's castle where they were machine gunned. My mother jumped off the truck and smuggled herself into the Lutsk ghetto. My father, Mayor Rothman, was one of 6 children. Only 2 survived the war, my father and 1 brother who escaped to Russia. My father was married before the war and had a child. His parents, brothers, sister, wife, and child were immediately taken and killed with the mass executions. My father was taken to work in the Lutsk ghetto, where he worked in the food warehouse. He anticipated that at some point they would liquidate the ghetto and devised a plan to borrow a space behind the bins of flour and barley in the warehouse. The space was large enough for 3 people, himself, a friend, and his cousin, who would become my mother. When they were about to liquidate the ghetto, the 3 of them hid in the space and waited 8 days until all was quiet and it was safe to come out. They found one of my mother's clients from before the war and begged to be hidden. They were hidden in his basement until the city of Lutsk was liberated on February 2nd, 1944. After the war, they connected with the Brecha and were transported to the DP camp in Barenwald, Germany, outside of Dachau. My parents were married in 1946. Both my brother and I were born in the DP camp and came to the US in 1951 to begin a new life. My father was a self-taught tailor and worked in the garment industry, and my mother honed her skills as a master seamstress. In 1965, my father was called to testify in Berlin against one of the guards of the Lutsk ghetto. My parents had 8 grandchildren and 15 great-grandchildren. We, our children, and our grandchildren are their legacy. We are their voices. We speak for those who have perished and were silenced. I'm Pesha Finkelstein-Rubenstein, and my mother is Rivka Schuster-Finkelstein, Bat Ruvain and Vayel Michal. My father, Zichrono Lichvodo, was Yankel Moshe Finkelstein, Ben Shleime, and Bulcha Michal. My mother was born in an eastern Polish village near the Bug River called Kvitnice. They had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Their village is now part of the Polish-Ukraine border and no longer exists. My father's village was Uchania. He had half-brother and 4 sisters. His father was a chazan. Uchania still exists, but today has no Jews living there. My mother survived largely by hiding in the deep Polish woods or in houses and towns abandoned by Gentiles. My father, Yankel Finkelstein, was rounded up with all of the Jewish families who thought that they were part of a population exchange. All of the Uchania Jews gathered in the market with horses and wagons laden with all of their belongings. Women and children were taken to the train station. Yankel later learned that they were taken straight to Sobibor. The men were taken to a work camp called Stav. My father escaped from Stav with his father using a razor blade to cut through the barbed wire. They made their way back to Uchania, where they were discovered after 17 days. They were arrested at night and put on a wagon. The Gentiles tied only my father's hands behind his back. Somehow his father untied his hands and told him to jump off the wagon and run for his life. His last words to him were in Yiddish, the Yiddish steshke that kemonish zan ibegavoksen. The Jewish path will never become overgrown. Yankel survived with some friends in the woods where they lived in holes in the ground that they concealed with branches. They survived on potatoes that they stole from farmers at night. My parents met after the war. They were each selling items on the black market, and they met through these dealings. They married in Poland in January 1946 and came to New York in 1950 with 2 children. They ran a dairy luncheonette in Brownsville and Brooklyn, and then moved to Atco, New Jersey to work a chicken farm, where they had 2 more daughters. In 1981, they moved to Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I was born in Camden, New Jersey, and with my spouse, had 3 children, each named for family members who perished in the Holocaust. My parents had 4 children, 6 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. The Jewish path will never become overgrown.
סילבר ספרינג עושים לכבוד יום השואה. הנה זה מה-NIH, כן, ג'קובסון. הוא כנראה מארגן את זה.
I'd like to express my gratitude to all 6 participants and for their sharing their own family stories. Thank you once again. Our guest speaker tonight, Mrs. Ray Goldfarb, known in her youth as Rachel, has been a volunteer and an active speaker on behalf of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and at other venues, such as the annual U.S. federal government Holocaust commemoration last year. She was interviewed in the 2021 First Person program at the museum, and you can look that up afterwards on YouTube. She is our neighbor in Wheaton and belongs to Har Zion Agudat Achim Synagogue. Ray's late husband, Harvey Goldfarb, Alav HaShalom, was also a Holocaust survivor and had his own inspiring story of survival and perseverance. His actions led to the liberation of a camp of sick and dying prisoners, which the Germans had abandoned. We honor Harvey's memory tonight. Now we will hear from Ray, her story of survival. At the end, she will answer questions from the audience. So please enter your questions into the chat. You can direct them towards me during the program, and we'll try to get to all of them. It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Mrs. Ray Goldfarb.
Shalom, everyone. And thank you for listening to me and to give me the opportunity to tell you my story. It's hardly a story. It's a big experience of life and death. I was born in what is now Belarus. At that time, at the time of my birth, it was Poland. A small town northeast of Vilna, which was a big Jewish center. About half the town of Doksycy was Jewish. Most of the inhabitants in Doksycy were occupied in business. My town, Doksycy, was just about 4 kilometers from the Russian border, and there was a military base at the edge of the town. My parents were engaged in commerce. My father had a meat and produce business, and my mother had a fabric store. Mother did most of her buying in wholesale in Vilna and in Lodz, and she traveled quite a bit. The household was mostly run by my fraternal grandmother and hired help. The store was adjacent to the house, and my father's meat business was close by on the other side of the what was our yard, or should I say the enclosure. My father also supplied meat to the military base, which gave the town access to kosher meat, because with bribery, he was able to get the slaughter done by a shochet, which was really a big help to the Jewish population of town, because shechita was limited. In 1939, the Germans and the Russians had an agreement, and half of Poland was occupied by Russia and half by Germany. We woke up one morning in 1930, this sort of end of summer of 1939, with Russian tanks in the street. Businesses were confiscated. The Russians took everything over. They did not allow any private business. Not only that, they evicted families from their homes to make room for their Russian personnel that came to take over the management of the businesses that they took over. Schools were closed. I was attending a Hebrew school, was actually a modern Hebrew school that taught Sfardit, and I still speak some Hebrew from my remembering it from my early days. I had to go to a Russian school and listen to indoctrination by the Russian regime. Some of the more prominent and richer inhabitants of the town were deported to Russia, to Siberia. I remember having suitcases packed with the expectation that we might be also deported. We only wish we had. My father had passed away in 1937 after coming back from a trip delivering produce to the German border. He came back with some sort of infection. It was prior to penicillin days, and he was never able to survive the infection. In 1941, the Germans did not honor the agreement with Russia and declared war on Russia. It didn't take them long to occupy the part of Poland that was under Russian control. The soldiers did not want to fight very much. Many of the Russian army was taken prisoner by the Russians, and were basically taken off their outer clothing and shoes and made them march through the town. Some of them managed to escape to the forests where they organized into groups. The Germans very quickly started their oppression of the Jews. First of all, we were ordered to put on yellow stars on the outer clothing and inner clothing. Walking on the sidewalk became a dangerous act because we would be shoved into the gutter. Needless to say, the gutters were not very clean because most of the transportation was by horse and buggy. And when it rains, it was treacherous. Schools were closed to the Jewish children. So our schooling basically was by a melamed that came to the house. Within a couple of months, actually in November of 1941, a ghetto was established. Picture, please. The ghetto was around the square where the synagogues were located. I know there were several synagogues. I know that my maternal grandfather belonged to a different synagogue than my father. He was a mitnaged, and my father was oh my golly, my father, I can't remember the denomination now. But anyway, I think there were 3 or 4 synagogues in town, and they were mostly around that square that you see white above the red arrow. There were several streets that were included in the ghetto. One side was bordered by the river Dvar, and the rest, one side by the marketplace where the churches were located. And then there were barbed wires surrounding the ghetto. Our house fell within the ghetto, and the red arrow points to approximately where our house was. The front of the street, the houses had gates to the properties, and all the gates were closed. My mother had actually distributed some of the fabrics to clients, farmers in surrounding villages, and they were kind enough to drop some supplies for us, some food supplies at the gate, which we were at night, which we were able to retrieve. The houses were very crowded because I remember people sleeping on the floor and rolling up their bedding in the morning so that they could move around in the house. And the kitchen had to serve everyone. Everybody shared things. It wasn't long before conditions in the ghetto became very bad. People were taken to forced labor to tend to not just the Germans, but also some of the inhabitants of the town. Most of the people in Belarus were very belligerent. It was impossible to try to get out of the ghetto. A few men had managed to escape from work details to join the Russian underground in the forests. When the Jews came back from their assignments, they were counted when they left and counted when they came back, and discovered that several of the Jews had been missing. The ghetto was organized to be supervised by a committee that were answering to the Germans. They approached the committee to supply 10 men for each one escapee. They lined them up in the ghetto and executed them. Basically, they shot every one of them in front of the population of the ghetto. People were reluctant to try to escape. Every so often, Jews were asked to gather in the square, the synagogue square, to be counted. At one time, with the order that some of the Jews were going to be deported, or should I say resettled, they called it, to a larger ghetto, we found out that they had actually taken them to a pit and murdered them. The pit was right in front of the synagogue. The ghetto picture, please. No, the ghetto picture. The pit was by the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery. The next time they announced a resettlement, the Jews did not come out to the square. We had a hiding place that was between two walls, between the house and the warehouse, was covered with one roof, so it was not very visible from the street. It was built in order to hide things from the whenever there were pogroms, and also that the people could hide in there, especially the men, because they would pull out the men and try to kill them. When the people were taken away from the ghetto, they actually, the Nazis and the population, with the population's help, went from house to house searching for Jews, pulling them out and taking them away, and of course, looting the houses. My mother, my brother, and I, and my grandparents and some other people were able to hide in this particular place that we had between the walls. Some of the people could not stand the claustrophobia, went out, never came back. My grandfather went out to see what was happening when it became quieter. He never came back. We stayed in the hiding place for about 8 or 9 days. And then when it was very quiet, we came out of the hiding place. We also had another hiding place that was in a pantry accessible to a root cellar. As we came out, we heard somebody in the house. We quickly hid in that second hiding place, the root cellar. And my grandmother was the last one out. She did not make it into the root cellar, but she quickly covered us and sacrificed herself in order to save us. We stayed in the root cellar until the next night and then ventured out of the ghetto. We went to a nearby village, Gentiles that were very friendly with us. My brother, my mother, and I were hidden by some of the farmers there. However, my brother was exposed. And word came to us that they were looking for us. They knew my mother very well, knew the family very well. And somebody said that we were not amongst those that they captured. We very quickly were dispersed. My mother and I were hiding in a bathhouse. There were no baths in every house like here in the United States. the bathhouse was only used on Saturdays for the farmers to bathe, to get ready for Sunday church. We stayed in that bathhouse overnight, and one of the farmers that hit us came to the bathhouse and told us that it was being searched to try to find us. And so we left very quickly. We ventured out. We hid during the day in the cornfields and walked by night. Different farmers had given us food and sometimes shelter, but were afraid to hide us. We made our way to the Głębokie ghetto. Głębokie was a town which had a larger Jewish population and a bigger ghetto, and also there was some industry there. You can see here a spinning, they called it a spinning mill, where Jewish women were laboring as spinners. I was given the opportunity to work there. Actually, I was born in 1932, but my mother got me papers that I was born in 1930. And at the age of 12, I qualified for work outside the ghetto. Mother got work outside the ghetto too. We were part of the workforce from the ghetto and were able to leave every morning for our jobs and return at night. Conditions in the ghetto were getting bad too. The German armies were progressing further into Russia. The military were moving on, and the Jews were starting to feel the pressure and some executions. One day from work, returning from work, we mingled with the farmers from the marketplace and escaped. We managed to reach the partisans, which was the Russian underground, and managed to be accepted, my mother as a cook and I as her helper, with a forward group. We were just at the edge of the forest. The reconnaissance group, the job was to interrupt the trains and communication. They would cut the telephone wires on the poles and try to dislodge the trains that were carrying soldiers and ammunition to the front lines by moving the rail ties under the rails, and so the trains would dislodge. That's how they also gained some weapons. The partisans, bring up the picture, please. The partisans, as you can see, had very few rifles. There were two women in this picture. This picture was taken by a Jewish partisan who was a photographer and managed to escape with her camera. There are a lot of photos from the partisans that she had taken at the San Francisco Holocaust Memorial Museum. And it was quite a ragtag army. We lived at the edge of the forest, very close to the outside where the Germans were. However, that was the only group that would accept my mother and I. We later found out that the head of the group, what they called Nachalnik, was Jewish. His name was Charney, and later on we found out his name was actually Schwartz. He hid his Jewishness, and I guess this summer, he helped a woman and a child survive. I got sick with typhus and had to go further into the forest where there was a makeshift hospital to be treated. Next picture, please. Next one. It was a ragtag hospital. The hospital was there to basically patch up partisans who got injured bullet wounds or cuts of some sort. But my mother knew the woman that was working in that hospital. She was actually a midwife. But since there were no doctors were very few and far between, she was given the ability to perform some surgeries. She knew how to thread a needle and close a wound. As the Germans started to retreat, they had a front line, the Russians in the front and the partisans in the back. And in order to free themselves of the back front, they went after the partisans. They very quickly dispersed into the population. And needless to say, we had to try to get mixed in with the population too. What they did was take the population out from their villages and collected them, of all places, my hometown, Doksycy, in a warehouse. Mother and I were with the group. Unfortunately, from typhus, I had my hair shorn or shaved, and I was dressed in boys' clothing. We were with the farmers, and eventually they started to separate the men from the women. I was not recognized right away. They were arguing whether I'm a girl or a boy, and being afraid from being separated from my mother. I said that one word that got me in trouble. I said, Mädchen, girl. If I knew the word Mädchen, they decided I started to argue that I might be Jewish and put me on the gallows and told me that to tell them the truth. Mother came out. She was really afraid to show her face there, but there was no way she was going to let them hang me. She started to argue with the soldier that I'm her daughter, that she was doing laundry for the Germans, and I learned a few words of German. They hang her first. She used the Solomonic rule. Hang me first. I don't want to see my child hung. Eventually, they let us go. We wandered from village to village when they sent the farmers back home, not having a place to go. Mother named a faraway village that she knew of, and basically we traveled from village to village, getting shelter with some of the farmers here and there and a bit of food. Eventually, we found out that some of the partisans reorganized. We found them and joined them and were liberated in the summer of 1944. So from 1942 until 1944, we were basically trying to survive. We were afraid to go back to our hometown at first because we knew that many of the Jews were killed. We went back to Głębokie, which was a bigger city, and there were some survivors. We lived in one house. However, we found that we were not safe. Somebody was actually hacked to death one night, and Mother decided we need to get out of there. Having been a partisan, she was able to enlist into the Russian workforce.
Thank you. You too.
To,
You don't have plastic spoons, right?
sorry?
Oh,
To enlist in the Russian workforce, and we traveled in a boxcar attached to the work train that was our home. When it became too dangerous, we managed to get ourselves to Lublin, where we found a Jewish population that was housed in one apartment house. The Bricha was working already to try to get Jews out of Poland and to Israel. We traveled from country to country with the help of the Bricha until we came through the passes of the Alps into Italy. When we came through the passes of all people, we were met by a Jewish flag, the Magen David on a white and background. And needless to say, we thought we were hallucinating. We found out that they were helping Jews to try to go to Israel. However, we were not fortunate enough. We ended up in Italy for almost 2.5 years before coming to the United States in 1947. The only thing that I have from my former life is a picture of my brother, my mother, and I, picture before this one, that was saved by a neighbor. Mother went back to our hometown to see who might have survived. This neighbor gave my mother this picture. She said she found it in the trash. She never looted our house. However, she saved it as a memento. We were at a resort place in 1939, before the war started. My brother, my mother, and I. And that's the only picture I have from my previous life. My aunt and uncle, my father's sister and her husband, brought us to the United States. They applied for us, and we were able to emigrate in November 1947. He immediately enrolled me in school. Since I knew Hebrew, he sent me to a Hebrew school, and then I went to public school. That is my life story. I speak at the museum because I feel, as a survivor of a town of almost 3,000 Jews, only about probably less than 24 survived, that it is my responsibility to speak about it, to remember them, because that's the only memory of their having lived at one time. I feel that this is the only memorial for them. There are no pictures, no names, no lists. The Germans didn't give them numbers. They basically vanished as if they never existed. I feel the responsibility to speak, to teach about what hate can do and how belligerence and lack of compassion can generate more hate toward Jews. We have to do something to teach the population, to teach this in the schools, to prevent such atrocities to ever happening again. Thank you all for listening.
And you're muted.
Yep. Thank you very much, Ray, for this heart-wrenching story of your survival, and which is very vivid and has taught us a lot of lessons. And we are now open to questions. If anyone wants to type a question in the chat, you could address it to me or just put it in the general chat. I have one question, Ray. There's a story about the World War I, when your grandfather had helped the German soldiers and had them in his home. And do you know the story I'm referring to?
I know exactly the story. It's just my story is so, my experiences have taken so many different turns that I can't cover everything.
Yes.
The Russians were extremely oppressive to us. And my grandfather, having survived the First World War, said that the Germans were much more how should I say, human, humane, that he housed some soldiers in his home, and he recognized one of them who was an officer, a higher officer that came through our town. He tried to say hello to him, and the officer motioned to him not to speak to him. However, he came in the evening to visit my grandfather and brought an orange as a peace offering and told my grandfather that this German army is not the German army that was here during the First World War. I don't know how many of you know the history of the Russian armies that invaded what was then became Poland. And a lot of them were Kyrgyz, and they were terrible. They killed Jews, they beat up Jews, and Jews had to hide from them. The German army did not, at that time, mistreat the Jews. On the contrary, they were quite civilized toward the Jews.
One question is, could you please explain the term brecha?
Brecha was a Jewish organization from Israel. And the volunteers from Haganah actually came to Poland and Hungary and tried to organize Jews to Israel. There was no way to get through. We were actually meandering from country to country. We went through Czechoslovakia, we came to Hungary, we came to Austria, were met by the British army, and they sent us back to the Russian side. They didn't want us. And then with some guides who led us through the pass into Italy, where we met the Hebrew Brigade. They called them the Donkey Brigade. And actually one of the soldiers there who heard our story and came and asked me where I'm from. And when I told him, and I spoke Hebrew, I could still converse quite well in Hebrew. And I told him that nobody heard of the town. He said, well, what was it? And I found out that he was actually from the same town, and his sister, of all the people, was my governess. She taught me Hebrew. And she emigrated to Israel. The town had quite a reputation of chalutzim who emigrated to Israel. There was quite a big group in Israel. And actually, I found in Israel a distant cousin of my father's, who was one of the organizers of Kibbutz Dan. And we were fortunate enough, my husband and I, to visit them at the kibbutz. Nice. After the 73 war. And he was an aloof, the husband. However, he was a kibbutznik all the way. When it was peace, he became a chalutznik. When there was war, he was back into the army. And he took my husband on a mishmar, a reconnaissance into the Syrian Heights, the occupied Syrian area.
So another question is, what did you and your mother eat when you were hiding or running? How did you?
What did we eat?
Yeah.
I remember eating the kernels of corn from the stalks. I also potatoes. My mother became the cook. My mother didn't cook at home. She had to learn to cook afterwards. In the ghetto, my aunt cooked. And she learned to cook. She learned to use onions. And actually, we would gather mushrooms in the forest and cranberries and dandelions, whatever we could find that was edible. The farmers gave us some supplies. The partisans were basically their defense against the Germans confiscating their cattle and their grain. And with the partisans there, the Germans didn't venture in. And one of the things that the partisans did, the Germans that ventured in and that they captured and took their uniforms, they would just leave them in their underwear and chase them back into the German occupied area. And when they said they'll be shot, they were advised to say that the farmer caught them with their daughters and chased them out. But they did not kill them because that would have probably been bad repercussions.
When the Nazis captured your brother, how did you find out what happened to him?
Actually, the farmer that hid my brother was a very good friend of my father's. And many times he had a son the same age as my brother, and they played together. And my mother, the first farmer we went to was this particular farmer. And he offered actually to keep my brother. But the problem was that the belligerent population knew of my family's friendship with some of the villagers and knew exactly where to look for her, because obviously they missed the fact that she was not caught and not executed with the rest of the population from the ghetto. One of the boys actually survived and came here to America eventually, but he was shot in the leg and managed to get out from under the bodies that covered him and come back to the ghetto and tell about all this.
Can you tell us a little more about your life in America? What did you think when you first arrived in America? How did you adjust?
How did I adjust? That in itself is another experience. We came in, we almost drowned about a day out of New York. There was a big storm. We were on a military transport ship, and we managed to get into the Brooklyn Harbor. We never passed the Statue of Liberty. When we docked and went on board of ship, the deck of ship, the only thing I could see was strings of, I didn't know they were lights on a bridge. And I was wondering what it was. They were red, a string of red and a string of white that was moving along. I later found out it was a bridge. I've never seen any structures like that. My uncle came to meet us at the ship and took us to cousins of his, a house in Brooklyn. Never saw anything like that, was used to house. Italy really was quite advanced and quite beautiful, but still it was not a Jewish home. We came in on a Wednesday and he took us back to Washington, D.C., where they lived. And it was a week before Thanksgiving. My first Thanksgiving was quite an experience. He had a grocery store, and his children came back from school and went down to the store to help out. I have 3 cousins, 3 girls. And I have one cousin, I was between the oldest cousin and the middle one. I too went down to the store, but I didn't know much English. I learned some words because there were schools in the displaced persons camps. But the customers taught me English. If they wanted peace and pointed to it, I repeated, and I learned some English words very quickly. I realized that some of the words were similar to German, and some of them were similar to the smidgen of Italian that I knew. And I started to understand a little bit. The Thanksgiving table was quite an experience. I've never seen anything like that. A big turkey and all the fixings and family and friends around.
So jumping around to different topics again, how were you and your mom able to navigate and find your way into the forest and go from village to village?
Well, Mother knew the villages because of customers that came to the store. And I don't know exactly, but she knew the geography of the area quite well. And so she knew the names of the villages and she knew where they were located in proximity to each other. I remember some of it. I remember that we went to, first of all, to a house that the woman took care of my brother. She was a single woman and we went there and Mother got her to go back to Doksycy to find out what happened to my brother. She said we should have gone there first. She would have claimed him as her own son. However, it was quite a distant village. And she went back into town and we hid in the fields during the day. She came back and said that she found out that he was shot. To just go on, she was afraid to hide us because they would put two and two together and come looking for us. And I remember the farmer who hid us actually for a couple of days and managed to help us smuggle into the Głębokie ghetto. She was a French woman, a widow of a Polish soldier that she had met during the First World War, married him and came with him home to Poland. And she had a daughter my age and two sons. However, she was afraid to hide us because she had to depend on farmers from the outside village for help, and we would be discovered. However, she sent us with one of the sons, dressed my mother in her clothing and me in the daughter's clothing. And he took the wagon to the market with the produce to sell. And that's how we got to Głębokie.
You and your mother were so resourceful, and thank God you had the presence of mind to navigate through that.
I didn't have the presence of mind. My mother was resourceful, but she was also brave.
Right. When you were in Italy, first of all, where did you end up in Italy? And were there Jewish organizations that took care of you there?
Yes, we ended up, well, first of all, we came across to Padua. Then we were in Quonset huts in Bologna. And eventually, actually, we were on a truck to one of the ports in Italy. There was a ship going, a vessel going to Israel. However, the truck broke down. So we ended up back in Bologna in the displaced persons camp. Well, now it became the United Jewish Appeal, but it was at that time a Jewish philanthropic organization that had some people in Italy helping Jews. And eventually UNRWA had a camp in Santa Caesarea, and we were transferred there. We almost ended up on the Exodus. However, my mother got sick and ended up in the hospital. And so again, we were not able to go. Mother knew my aunt's address in Washington, but she forgot the DC. And she sent the letters to the address in Washington, United States, came back with no such address, didn't know that there was a state named Washington. However, she was able to put an ad into the Forwards newspaper. My uncle saw it and contacted us and made out papers for us to come to the United States. The Polish visa was full against my mother's resourcefulness. She went to the American Council in Naples and convinced him that we really should come on the Russian visa. She found out that the Russian visa was not full, and she named him all the villages around, just across the border from us. He took out a map that she didn't look at, but she told him the distances between the villages, and he was convinced that she was telling him the truth, almost the truth. And we came here actually on the Russian visa. We had no documentation. The only document we got was from the Red Cross. And she was so afraid that we would be sent back to Belarus that she told them that I was born in Lublin, Poland. So if we didn't get anywhere else, at least we wouldn't go back to where our actual home was.
Did you or your mother ever go back to Europe, Eastern Europe?
No. Belarus is still dangerous to Jews.
Yeah.
I don't remember the year, but actually the Jews were told to leave. And I don't know if anybody remained there.
So the final question is a very ominous issue. How do you understand the recurrence of anti-Semitism today? Do you believe that Jews are safe in America today?
Who knows? Anti-Semitism has been prevalent in many places for ages. It's a religious issue, really. I'm afraid to say it, but the church is much responsible for that, spreading stories about Jews. I'll tell you one that my husband told me. Well, actually, I found out by someone else about an experience my husband had in the army. When he came here, he was young enough. He was young. He was drafted put into the Korean War. My husband emigrated on a visa that was ready for his family. However, they didn't manage to get out in time. He had a big extended family here in the United States. His mother was one of 6, and all the siblings were here except for his mother. In the army, he found that one soldier, followed him wherever he went. The soldier was right with him. If my husband picked a lower bunk, he picked an upper bunk. He was a big guy, so my husband was afraid that he would fall through on top of him. So he asked him to change bunks. Eventually, he asked him, my husband asked the soldier, "Why do you follow me?" Whenever my husband was assigned to be on guard duty, he volunteered on guard duty. Whenever my husband was given KP, kitchen duty, he volunteered for kitchen duty. And eventually he told him he wants to see where his horns are. His grandfather told him that the Jews have horns and they come out at night. I wouldn't have believed the story. He never actually told me the story until afterwards. But I was home and I got a phone call from someone that asked us if this was the home of Harvey Goldfarb. I said, yes. May I speak to him? I'm sorry, he's at work. I can give you his phone number. He said, oh, I'm a friend of his from the army. I said, I'll give you your phone number and you can call him. He says, no, Who should I say called for him? Tell him the guy that looked for his horns. Then I asked my husband, what is the story about the horns? I think that should give you an idea why anti-Semitism is spread.
Right.
We are responsible for all the ills. It's the blame game.
Yes, it goes back a long way. So if there are no further questions, we can begin the conclusion. And I'd like to echo some of the comments in the chat. Thank you, Ray, for your courage and your strength, for sharing your incredible story with us. Thank you for sharing all your experiences, so meaningful. I think you've really made a tremendous impression on our community. So thank you once again, Ray, for sharing your story with us. I'd also like to thank the other committee members, Rabbi Dovid Rosenbaum of Young Israel Shomrai Emunah, Rabbi Bram Weinberg of KMS, the office staff at the shuls and officers of the sponsoring organizations, Menashe Katz for technical support, and the ASL interpreter Miriam Kramer and Noam Katan. The committee encourages participation by anyone in our local community. So if you're interested in joining the committee, please contact me or anyone else on the committee. So before we sign off, we will have the singing of Hatikva by Noam Katan, who is a member of our community and a student at the Berman Hebrew Academy. And I wish you all a good night. So
I'd like to add something.
please.
Things like this will happen again unless we're active to try to stop it from happening again. The Holocaust Museum is very active in lobbying Congress, in the whole community, to speak out against anti-Semitism and against hatred that is spread. And that's why I speak, and that's why all of our survivors that are still remaining speak out, because we want to see that it is prevented from happening again. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. We'll now have the singing of Hatikva. Please load it.
Hold on a second. Sorry about that.
כל עוד בלבב פנימה, נפש יהודי הומייה, ולפת מזרח קדימה, עין לציון צוביה, עוד לא עמדה תקוותנו, התקווה בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים.
Oh, Eddie Mintz.